This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Leaders from China, Japan and South Korea meet their ASEAN counterparts to boost trade and supply chains under the world's biggest free trade deal to chart East Asia's next growth phase. Now, Donald Trump arrives in Japan for the next leg of his Asia tour. A royal welcome today and tomorrow. Talks with the new Prime Minister Takaichi in her first big test with tariffs and defense on the table. Now, equity markets on a roll. Stocks rallying past key milestones as trade optimism fuels confidence. But gold loses its shine and treasuries tumble as safe haven demand fades. China and India resume direct flights after 5 years in a cautious thaw of frosty relations between the two Asian giants. Also tonight, Jiro Ono turns 100, but the legendary sushi chef who once rejected a reservation for Shinzo Abe and Barack Obama wants to keep working while setting his sights on a new world record. China is pressing for stronger economic ties and more open trade at the ASEAN Summit in Malaysia, a gathering dominated by the shadow of steep U.S. tariffs. Now, Southeast Asian leaders huddling with their global partners to boost trade to cushion the blow of the tariff war. Members of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, called for wider trade efforts and faster addition of new members in its first summit since 2020. The Free Trade Pact currently involves 10 ASEAN nations, along with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, covering about 30% of global GDP, making it the world's largest trading bloc. Earlier, a summit of ASEAN members, plus China, Japan and South Korea, concluded, with Chinese Premier Li Qiang calling for all parties to uphold free trade and oppose protectionism, a phrase that Beijing has used to call out the Trump tariffs. Today's proceedings coming after a whirlwind visit by U.S. President Donald Trump on Sunday. For more, we are now joined by CNA senior correspondent Leong Wai-kit in Kuala Lumpur and also our correspondent Deborah Wong in Shenzhen. Well, first I'll start with you, Wai-kit. President Trump, we know he witnessed the signing of the Thai-Cambodia peace accord. Tell us, what signal do you think is the White House trying to send with regard to the security architecture in our region? And these signals, I mean, how are they going to be read by ASEAN and China?
Well, for ASEAN, any peace project that brings stability and prosperity will be welcome. But you are right, Oteli, the presence of U.S. President Donald Trump in Asia and witnessing that peace deal does send a very strong message. It can be seen as Washington renewing its commitment on peace in the region. It can also be seen as Mr. Donald Trump anchoring himself in the region with more tangible projects, so to speak. But can also be seen as a signal to China that despite its ASEAN neighborhood diplomacy, Washington is also featuring itself more prominently in the region. Now, I spoke with an analyst who revealed to me that some quarters in Cambodia were actually disappointed with China during the Thai-Cambodia border dispute on two counts. One, they were disappointed that China did not do more to push Thailand to the negotiating table, and they were also disappointed that they were told by China, which sells weapons to Cambodia, to not use certain types of weapons during those 5 days of active fighting with Thailand. Now, analysts also point out that traditionally China focuses more defense engagement and partnerships with mainland Southeast Asian states, whereas Washington would do that with maritime states. But since 2017, Washington has been expanding its partnerships with more mainland Southeast Asian countries. And this certainly tilts the balance in terms of the superpowers which are in our region in the security architecture.
Wai-kit, now that President Donald Trump has departed from Kuala Lumpur, what exactly is the bloc's focus today, and also what deals can we expect?
Well, Oteli, if you heard Melissa Goh, our Malaysian correspondent's commentary earlier today, she had described yesterday when Mr. Trump was in town as a day of transactions, of how individual countries were trying to make deals, bilateral deals with Washington. And if that were the tone yesterday, then the tone for today is negotiations, but by ASEAN as a bloc. And one of them, as you said earlier, is negotiating for RCEP to be rolled out more speedily. And if that were rolled out, it would mean lower tariffs and freer movement of goods. In fact, Indonesia had called for RCEP to be a platform for rules-based trade. And if ASEAN were to lay out all its priority projects on the table, it can look to its +3 partners who can collaborate. And these projects can include clean energy, AI, managing public health crisis, including fighting scam centers which are operating in the region. Now let's take a listen to what South Korean President Lee Jae-myung had to say on this.
정상 여러분, 최근 법 집행 사각지대인 국경 지역을 중심으로 스킴센터 등 조직적 범죄 단지가 확산되고 있고 안타깝게도 많은 청년들이 초국가 범죄의 희생양이 되고 있습니다. 이에 한국 경찰청은 아세안 폴가의 수사 공조를 통해 조직적 범죄 단지를 건절하고 초국가 범죄가 이 지역에서 더 이상 발붙일 곳이 없도록 협력을 강화해 나갈 것입니다. 아세안 각국 및 아세안 차원에서의 긴밀한 형사, 사법 공조를 통한 문제 해결 또한 모색해 나가겠습니다.
Now, Deborah, let's bring you into the conversation. Let's talk about China and ASEAN. They are expected to upgrade their free trade within this year. And how is that going to look?
So we can expect to see more integration on both sides across 3 specific points. We're looking at digital trade, sustainability, stronger exchanges between SMEs on both sides. In fact, you just heard from YKit that the ASEAN priority is also looking at AI development and digital trade. And we can expect to see simplified customs processes, for instance, lower regulatory barriers, in fact, between ASEAN and China. So in terms of real-life application, perhaps more support for e-commerce, cross-border data flows, basically align with the emerging sectors that both ASEAN and China have identified, to push both economies forward. In fact, both sides have grown closer together recently. Chinese exports to ASEAN, for instance, in the first 7 months of this year grew nearly 14%, which observers have attributed, to an impact coming out of the U.S. tariffs that we saw earlier this year. Now, China also remains ASEAN's largest trading partner, with trade growing about $980 billion in 2024. We've also seen a very much stronger, bigger Southeast Asian delegation at, Chinese events. A case in point at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit this year in Tianjin, where Anwar was there, where Prabowo, in fact, was attended the Beijing military parade shortly after. We do know that China collectively, with all these events, all these close bilateral meetings, they are seeking to strengthen relationship with Southeast Asia, with East Asia as well, even as frictions in the South China Sea are present. In fact, Chinese Premier Li Qiang made very, very clearly known that openness and dialogue really remains the way forward, even as they try to deal with geopolitical challenges. Have a listen.
我们坚持开放合作，我们才能超越社会制度等差异，根据各自的禀赋和经济规律，实现了各国优势互补、分工协作。正是因为我们坚持了开放合作，我们才能避免把经济问题泛政治化、泛安全化。通过沟通、对话、管控和化解分歧，尽量减少对经济发展的干扰。
Deborah, some progress on the U.S.-China trade talks just this past weekend. But the rare earths issue, though, that remains a sticking point. Do we have any indication how you think China is going to be handling it?
So not in the specifics, because the official statements didn't reveal too much from the Chinese side. We do know that they say a framework was achieved. There's an acknowledgement that both sides had very frank, in-depth conversations on how to deal with shipping, extension of the tariff deadline, law enforcement cooperation, as well as some export controls. And details would, of course, need to be approved internally. On the U.S. side, we're seeing statements coming out saying that the framework will potentially avoid 100% U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, potentially also defer China's rare earths exports control. But one thing that both sides have been quite consistent on, that they can both agree on, is that they seem to be leaving the final details for both Trump and Xi to bang out, potentially in a meeting that we could possibly see later this week at the APEC Summit in South Korea. Now, China most recently expanded its rare earths export control, so that has been a very huge sticking point, not just affecting the relationship with the U.S., but also raised quite strong concerns with the EU as well. In fact, EU President Antonio Costa, he met with Chinese Premier Li Qiang on the sidelines of ASEAN today, and he basically urged China to quickly restore reliable and predictable supply chains. We have not seen any statements coming out from the Chinese side yet, but we do know that China does view itself as a pretty fair player in world trade. You've seen the statements coming out of the ASEAN +3 summit. You've seen multiple narratives coming out of China saying that they want to play fair. They want to uphold multilateralism. They want to, steer clear from protectionism. So analysts do say it is in China's best interest to balance the books, to sort of seek a more equitable relationship with the EU and other trade partners as well. But of course, more clarity will only be seen in the upcoming APEC summit later this week. Italy.
And we shall be looking out for that. Thanks so very much, CNA's correspondent Deborah Wong in Shenzhen, and also senior correspondent Liang Wai-kit in Kuala Lumpur. U.S. President Donald Trump has arrived in Japan, the second stop of his Asian tour. Mr. Trump says he's looking forward to meeting the country's newly elected Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, tomorrow. Mr. Trump touched down at Haneda International Airport in Tokyo and has met with Emperor Naruhito at the Imperial Palace. The American leader is also expected to visit U.S. troops and speak with Japanese business leaders during his visit. Now, Ms. Takaichi, barely a week into her premiership, is facing her biggest diplomatic test yet. Now, defense spending, security ties, and investments are likely to top her meeting with Mr. Trump. And it has been widely viewed as a golden opportunity for Ms. Takaichi to reset relations with the U.S.
I hear great things about her. I think she's going to be great. She was a great friend of Mr. Abe, who was a great man, Prime Minister Abe, and a great friend of mine, as you know, and he was just a fantastic person, and he liked her a lot, she liked him a lot, so that's a good sign. I look forward to meeting her.
Well, Ms. Takaichi is pledged to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP this fiscal year, but the Trump administration wants that ramped up to 3.5% to deter China in the Indo-Pacific. Well, the Japanese leader emphasized cooperation in the region when she attended the ASEAN Summit yesterday.
Japan advocates for free and open Indo-Pacific and consistently support the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which shares fundamental principles with POIP.
Well, Ms. Takaichi is likely to seek reassurance from the U.S. leader about a decades-old security alliance. That's after Mr. Trump previously criticized the defense pact with Japan as one-sided. Well, currently, Tokyo pays Washington $1.4 billion per year for the costs associated with hosting American soldiers on its soil. Now, trade could prove equally thorny as Ms. Takaichi seeks clarity over an increasingly complex trade relationship. The Trump administration slashed levies on Japanese goods to 15% from 25% following months of negotiations. And in return, Tokyo agreed to invest $550 billion in American industries. But details of that deal have been vague. All right, time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight. China's industrial profits growing at their fastest pace in nearly 2 years in September. Plus, the world's biggest car maker, Toyota, maintains its growth streak in September, brushing aside volatility in China and higher U.S. tariffs. Hello there, you are just in time for your business update with Roland Lim. So Roland, let's talk about regional markets hitting new highs today in East Asia.
Right, yes. Over the weekend, top Chinese and US officials laid the groundwork for a trade deal. However, it's not a sure thing that Trump and Xi will seal the deal. Signs of easing trade tensions between China and the US boosting risk appetite in the region. Japan's Nikkei 225 closing above that 50,000 level for the first time, ending the day 2% in the green. The index has gained more than 28% so far this year. Investor sentiment also getting a boost from expectations of sizable spending from the nation's new prime minister. The broader Topics index climbing 1.7%. Meantime, though, the Japanese yen relatively unchanged against the dollar, 152.74, changing hands with $1. South Korea's benchmark Kospi index also topped 4,000 points for the first time, lifted by broader optimism over a potential US-China trade deal. It closed the day nearly up 3%. Now, Taiwanese stocks also notched fresh highs, rising 2.5% at one point, closing 1.7% in the green. The same positive sentiment clearly visible in Chinese equities as well. Shanghai Composite closing out the day more than 1% higher. Shenzhen did better than that. And in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index was led higher by chip makers SMIC and tech giants Baidu and Alibaba. Investors also cheering upbeat profit data at China's industrial companies. Industrial profits soared more than 20% on year in September. That's its fastest pace since 2023. This marks a second straight month of gains, signaling long-awaited measures designed to curb overcapacity and to rebalance the economy may be gaining traction. Our top leaders in July vowed to take steps to tackle loss-making, inefficient firms. And while this does give policymakers cause for optimism, analysts caution the actual strength of the recovery appears fragile, given the low comparison base last year. Adding to that, concerns of a prolonged property slump, a fragile job market, and heavily indebted local governments. Meantime, a relatively stronger US dollar and signs of easing US-China trade tensions weighing on gold. The safe haven metal is currently down 1.76%, 4,039.37 an ounce. Spot silver prices also extending their retreat from an all-time high, currently down 1.7%. The world's first stable coin pegged to the yen launched in Japan, in a country where cash and credit cards still dominate payments. A local startup, JPYC, began issuing these stable coins, also called JPYC. Now, these are fully convertible to the yen and backed by domestic savings and Japanese government bonds. The company aims to issue $66 billion worth of stablecoins over the next 3 years. The JPYC has ambitions of going global and says it does not plan to charge transaction fees for now. Global interest in stablecoins is gaining momentum, and earlier this month, Nikkei reported that Japan's 3 megabanks are also planning to issue a joint stablecoin. Stablecoins are a form of cryptocurrency typically backed by fiat currency. Data from the Bank of International Settlements, or BIS, shows that over 99% of stablecoins in circulation are pegged to the US dollar. Supporters say stablecoins are a less volatile alternative to cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum, and offer users a faster and cheaper way to conduct transactions. Despite tariff turmoil and volatility in China, Toyota Motors has recorded its 9th straight month of growth, with September sales up more than 3% on year. Growth was driven by the US market, which saw a 14% increase in sales on year, thanks to strong demand for gas-electric hybrids. Now, that tempered declines of around 5% in Toyota's home market and 1% in China. Toyota says cooling sales in Japan was due to a pullback in production after it recalled its Prius model last year due to faulty door handles. Global production also grew by around 11%, with growth from the US at nearly 30%, as Toyota resumed production of its TX and Grand Highlander models. China's production up more than 15% on the back of its new EV model, and up more than 8% on its home turf. Quick check on shares of Toyota ending the day up around 3%, 3,218 yen apiece. Now, China's Ceres Group, an EV maker partnered with Huawei, plans to raise up to $1.7 billion through a share sale in Hong Kong. The Chongqing-based company will issue over 100 million new shares. The pricing will be set on November the 3rd and trading will begin on November 5th. About 70% of the funds will go into research and development and 20% towards global marketing and charging networks. Ceres, already listed in Shanghai, has seen its revenue soar more than 300% back in 2024, thanks to its alliance with Huawei. But competition in China's EV market remains fierce, with Ceres' sales slipping slightly the first half of this year. Ceres is, of course, only one of 4 profit-making NEV makers globally. India's largest eyewear retailer, Lenskart Solutions, eyeing a valuation of around $8 billion in its upcoming IPO. The Gurugram-based company has priced shares at between 382 and 402 rupees, aiming to raise about 73 billion rupees at the top end. The IPO opens on the October 31st through to November 4th, with anchor bids on October 30th. Lenskart's backers include SoftBank, Kedara Capital, and Temasek. Founded back in 2010, Lenskart now runs about 2,700 stores globally and operates in a market expected to grow at a double-digit pace. The share sale comes amid a booming Indian IPO market, which could surpass last year's record $20.5 billion in listings. Now, oil prices rose today after U.S. and Chinese economic officials sketched out a trade deal framework, easing fears that tariffs and export curbs between the world's top 2 oil consumers could dent global economic growth. Let's have a quick check on where prices are. It's looking mixed. Brent crude is currently down 0.7%, $65.48 a barrel, while U.S. market West Texas Intermediate is up nearly 1%. Singapore International Energy Week is now underway, and topping the agenda is the balancing of the energy trilemma of sustainability, affordability, and security. There's also the rollout of next-generation renewables such as hydrogen and carbon capture. Now, earlier I spoke with the International Energy Agency's Executive Director, Fateh Birol, about the conflicting trends in climate change and energy policy.
So when it comes to climate change, I observe 2 conflicting trends in the world. I talk with the government leaders, with the business leaders and others. One trend is, when we look at the climate change, as you rightly mentioned, it was a key topic in the international policy agenda, but it is sliding down. Governments have other concerns and other headaches, and they give this immediate concerns the priority, such as the defense, such as the security, affordability, and others. This is one trend. But on the other hand, we see the impacts of climate change is becoming more and more obvious. 2024 was the hottest year in the history. Number of wildfires, droughts, heat waves are increasing their frequency and intensity. So, on one hand, you see more impact of climate change. On the other hand, the political importance given the climate change is sliding down. This is, of course, a very dangerous conflict.
Okay. Asia is behind on its targets to triple renewable energy by 2030. What are the top 2 things that governments must do today in order to catch up and meet those targets?
In fact, Asia, especially this part of Asia, Southeast Asia, is not doing bad in terms of solar, in terms of geothermal, hydropower. But if we want to accelerate this, one thing I would ask the governments to do is make the permitting and licensing of this project much faster and much nimble way, less bureaucracy, less regulation, and being much more nimble there. Because the potential is huge for solar, for wind, for geothermal. But when it comes to meeting the electricity demand, I believe the governments in this part of the world should give a good thought about the nuclear power to make the use of nuclear power. As I said 3 years ago here, we discussed nuclear power is making a comeback around the world.
Right, and the IEA says that because of data centers, Asia will need twice as much energy by 2030.
Exactly.
Will this mean more gas plants being used, and can the electricity grids here handle that demand?
Electricity demand growth is very strong in this region. So in the next 10 years, the region will add one Japan to the existing capacity, huge because of the increasing number of air conditioners, data centers driven by AI, and increasing electric cars. Penetration is very strong. So to meet that demand growth, we need, of course, LNG, as you mentioned, but renewables will play an important role, and also nuclear power. But building the power plant is not enough. We need also grids to bring the electricity from the power plants to the factories, to the homes, which is also lacking here. The renewables, LNG, but also nuclear power with the grids is the solution.
And you're up to date with the business news. Utali.
Thanks for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight.
It's very important to have that code of conduct. We are very much in favor of avoiding any kind of incident.
UN Chief Antonio Guterres tells CNA the importance of having a code of conduct when it comes to managing disputes in the South China Sea. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Global equity markets on a roll, stocks rallying past key milestones as trade optimism fuels confidence. But gold loses its shine, and treasuries tumble as safe haven demand fades. Leaders from China, Japan, and South Korea meet their ASEAN counterparts to boost trade and supply chains under the world's biggest free trade deal to chart East Asia's next growth phase. And Donald Trump arrives in Japan for the next leg of his Asia tour. A royal welcome today and tomorrow, talks with new Prime Minister Takaichi in a first big test with tariffs and defense on the table. Earlier, CNA spoke with Ross Feingold, head of research at Kairos Consulting, and he explained to us the significance of Mr. Trump's visit to Japan.
It's important for both sides. President Trump has been so focused on Europe and the Middle East as far as foreign policy goes, and now he's engaging directly with Asian leaders. So from the U.S. perspective in achieving U.S. foreign policy goals, whether that's trade or security, it's very important. And obviously for a new prime minister who's literally just days into the job, it's a real opportunity for her to show who she is and what her policies are and demonstrate that not just domestically, but to the region as well as to Japan's most important partner, which is the United States. So I think we should not underestimate the importance of this meeting for both sides. The challenge that she has is she doesn't really control the parliament. So getting legislation, especially a massive increase in defense spending through the parliament, is frankly going to be a big challenge. And if there is an election sometime in the near term, we really don't know yet what her plans are in that regard. It could result in an even more fractured parliament or even the LDP losing control. So it's difficult for Japan to make firm commitments to President Trump. That being said, this pressure from the United States, as long as President Trump is in office, and he will be for the next 3+ years, this will continue. The United States, the Trump administration, is not going to stop putting pressure on its partners in the Indo-Pacific region, whether that's Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, where I'm speaking from. They are all going to be under significant pressure for large defense spending increases.
Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says more can be done by ASEAN and 3 Asian powers, China, Japan and South Korea, in areas such as green finance and clean energy to keep the region strong and competitive. Now, he says that these nations should stay open and uphold a rules-based multilateral trading system, even with growing pressure to weaken it. Speaking at the ASEAN +3 summit in Kuala Lumpur, Mr. Wang said the regional bloc should also upgrade or rather update its trade agreements and urged countries to tap existing initiatives such as the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework and the ASEAN Power Grid to deepen cooperation in digital and green growth. Now, Mr. Wang says as one of the world's most vibrant regions today, ASEAN +3 nations cannot afford to be complacent. He says history has shown that countries thrive and flourish only when they remain open and pursue win-win cooperation. At a separate ASEAN meeting with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, Mr. Wang said the regional bloc and South Korea will start talks early next year for a free trade area upgrade. The current free trade area eliminates tariffs for 80% of the goods traded between ASEAN and Korea. He said the move will deepen economic ties and signal both sides' commitment to keeping markets open. Mr. Wang also encouraged South Korea to work with the region on existing clean energy projects and green finance efforts. Now, Mr. Wang also says that such trade negotiations signal that nations involved are committed to keeping markets open, even amid rising barriers in the world. As coordinator for ASEAN Republic of Korea Economic Relations, he says Singapore is committed to delivering a meaningful, forward-looking and mutually beneficial upgrade. Now, Australia and China highlighting common interest to keep ties stable, despite encounters in the South China Sea and rivalry over rare earths. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese described his meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang in Kuala Lumpur as positive.
Well, we have disagreements and friends are able to discuss issues frankly. I did that directly. That's what we're able to do.
China also giving a positive take on ties. The official Xinhua news agency cites Premier Li as saying relations are on the mend and that Beijing is ready for a more stable and strategic partnership with Canberra. Both sides traded barbs just last week after Australia said that a Chinese fighter jet released flares near one of its patrol planes over the disputed waters, describing it as unsafe and unprofessional behavior. Beijing later accused Canberra of trying to cover up an intrusion into Chinese airspace. Mr. Albanese said he raised the issue with Mr. Li, calling it an incident of concern for Australia. Now, the Australian leader also said they discussed Canberra's $8.5 billion critical minerals deal with Washington, with the United States seeking to tap on Australia's rich rare earth resources at a time when China is imposing tougher rules on exporting its own critical minerals abroad. Mr. Albanese did not directly answer when asked if the Chinese premier expressed an opinion on the US-Australia Minerals Pact. Now, the head of UN is also attending the ASEAN meetings in Malaysia. And one of the issues topping the summit's agenda, rising tensions in the South China Sea. Antonio Guterres praised ASEAN's efforts to accelerate negotiations on the Code of Conduct in disputed waters. And he spoke to CNA's senior correspondent, Afifa Arifin, expressing hope that countries involved can resolve their differences through dialogue.
It's very important to have that code of conduct. We are very much in favor of avoiding any kind of incidents. We are very much in favor of free navigation. We are very much in favor of the observation of the norms defined by the Convention of the Law of the Sea, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And we hope that dialogue will help overcome the present difficulties.
When asked about the UN's credibility, particularly the effectiveness of the Security Council, whose permanent members often hold divergent views, Mr. Guterres acknowledged that the body has been largely paralyzed on key issues. But he says the problem lies not within the UN, but the deep divisions among the world's major powers.
It is true that the Security Council is largely paralyzed in relation to the key issues, of course. Other aspects can be solved, but the key issues, there is this paralysis. And the reason is the division, the geopolitical division, especially divisions among superpowers. But that is not the problem of the UN. It's a problem of the divisions of the superpowers. So people should call a spade and attribute responsibilities to those that have responsibilities. And indeed, we need the reform of the Security Council. We have in the Security Council 3 European permanent members. No African, no Latin America, one Asian. This doesn't correspond to the world of today. Security Council needs to be reformed, composition needs to change, and to adapt to what is today's reality. And on the other hand, the right of veto has been used many times in defense of the interests of the members of the Security Council themselves, which, of course, makes the Security Council ineffective in addressing the worst crisis that we are facing in the world.
And we'll have more of this interview with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres later this evening on Asia Tonight at 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. Now, the US and China have agreed on a framework to avert a major tariff hike. Well, that agreement, discussed on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, could set the stage for a breakthrough when Trump and President Xi Jinping meet this week at APEC in South Korea. CNA's Grace Shin with this report.
A good deal with China.
The U.S. had been days away from slapping a 100% tariff on Chinese goods. But it seems to have pressed the brakes after sideline talks with Chinese officials at the ASEAN Summit, with both sides agreeing to a framework for progress. That framework reportedly includes a deal on TikTok's American operations, a pause on China's export curbs for rare earth minerals, and plans to resume soybean purchases from the U.S. The details to be hashed in South Korea, with the two leaders set to meet at or around a meeting of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Grouping. Analysts say if the two leaders sit down, a trade deal may not be far off.
So far, we have already 4 rounds of the negotiations since May 12th from Geneva. So I guess all these kind of hardworking reflects that both U.S. and China, both particularly the U.S. end, reflects the Trump's strong willingness to make a deal rather than no deal. Because if we believe that President Trump is a CEO style kind of president, then deal or any deal is better than no deal.
Those talks in Geneva in mid-May were followed by at least 4 more rounds in London, Stockholm, Madrid, and most recently, Kuala Lumpur, each aimed at laying the groundwork for a broader deal.
No one likes a bad summit. You've flown all the way, you've put in the effort, so no one wants a bad outcome. So what do I expect? I expect a strong dialogue on the sides of the APEC meetings, but also together with all 21 leaders of APEC. Now, that's very important because things can be done bilaterally, but they also need to be done together so people don't feel excluded from this process.
APEC brings together economies that make up 60% of global GDP, a forum built on free and open trade. But that mission is harder than ever as wars, protectionism, and tech rivalries reshape the global order.
In general, I agree. That is, APEC is not some kind of a very critical or serious kind of a leader summit where we have see those kind of breakthrough kind of policies or joint policies in the world or in the Asia Pacific region. But the point I do not agree is that the Phase 1 trade deal was actually decided in the Argentina APEC meeting in 2019 in December. So that means it is very likely that if the two presidents agree to meet in this APEC, then a new trade deal could be reached.
Despite tensions, there's been progress. Trade ministers this year agreed the WTO needs reform, a rare show of consensus.
Now, you might think that's really strange in this divided world, protectionist world, but look at that statement more carefully. What it says is we all agree that the WTO needs reform. That acknowledgement in and of itself is important because you go back 20 plus years, we hadn't even acknowledged that. So now we can agree the multilateral system needs reform, but then what do we do about it?
While free trade and multilateralism lie at the heart of APEC's ideals, all eyes are on whether a U.S.-China deal can stop a trade war from rewriting the rules of it. Grace Shin, CNA, Singapore.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, China and India resume direct flights after 5 years. What this renewed air link could mean for trade, diplomacy, and the balance of power across Asia. And the top Chinese diplomat makes a thinly veiled swipe at the US ahead of a possible meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping this week. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has warned of a forthcoming multipolar world just days before expected talks between US President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping in South Korea.
我们呼吁停止将经贸问题政治化，停止人为割裂全球市场，停止动辄挑起贸易战、关税战。
Mr. Wang was speaking at a forum in Beijing attended by former government officials, diplomats and business leaders. While he did not mention any country, his remarks were seen as a thinly veiled swipe at the US. Well, they come amid a flurry of diplomatic activity as President Trump is on his first visit to Asia. Also, as China says, it has come to a preliminary consensus on trade with the US after 2 days of talks in Malaysia. Mr. Wang also outlined President Xi's new global governance initiative, describing it as China's answer to improving global governance.
历史潮流无法逆转，多极世界正在到来。全球治理倡议坚持共商、共建、共享，主张全球事务大家一起商量，治理体系大家一起建设，治理成果 大家一起分享，拒绝一切单边主义行径。
China and India have resumed direct flights after a 5-year suspension. A flight operated by India's largest budget carrier, Indigo, arrived in Guangzhou from Kolkata early this morning, the first direct service since 2020. Now, direct air links from India's capital, New Delhi, to Shanghai and Guangzhou will begin next month. Flights were halted during the pandemic. Our relations then plummeted after deadly clashes along their shared Himalayan border in 2020, which left 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers killed. Well, the skirmish led to a freeze in ties. But over the past year, China and India have been working towards easing tensions, including steps to de-escalate their disputed border areas. Now, the Indian government says the resumption of flights will boost people-to-people contact and aid the gradual normalization of bilateral exchanges. The thaw between the two countries comes at a time when India's relations with the US have been strained by tariffs. Now, earlier we spoke with Pradeep Taneja from the University of Melbourne and started by asking him if the resumption of flights between China and India reflects a genuine thaw in relations.
I think it's an indication of improvement in relationship. There's still obviously lots of issues that need to be addressed, but clearly this is a step which will be welcomed by the business community in both countries, both in China and India. There are thousands of Indian traders who, before COVID, used to go to China for business purposes, flying to Shanghai, Kunming, and other places. And I'm sure this is a step which will be welcomed by that business community because it's been very inconvenient for them to do business with China.
Well, India still depends heavily on Chinese imports, especially in electronics and pharmaceuticals. What kind of economic or trade ripple effect could this renewed air connectivity trigger?
Well, there is really different types of businesses that trade between China and India. And you're right, Indian companies, particularly Indian manufacturing businesses, are heavily reliant on imports of components, and other essential, parts from China. So clearly this is a step that will be welcomed by them. Remember that even after 2020, you referred to the conflict on the border between India and China in 2020, which led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and, according to the Chinese, 4 Chinese soldiers. Now, that really disrupted the political relationship, diplomatic relationship. But by and large, the trade between China and India continued. The companies who import essential components from China they continue to do business with China, and therefore the business ties between China and India remain strong. And investment ties suffered because the Chinese government was not issuing visas to the Indians, and Indian government was refusing to issue visas to the Chinese. So investment ties were affected. But when it comes to trade ties continued. And I think this opening of direct flights between China and India should really help the business community, and this would certainly give a boost to trade ties.
And Pradeep, with Washington really imposing new tariffs on India, could this push New Delhi to diversify its partnerships and perhaps inch closer again to Beijing, at least economically?
There are, I think, structural constraints between China and India which would limit the scope of cooperation between these two countries. Remember, China and India are both very large countries, largest countries in Asia. In terms of population, India has now overtaken China. But both these countries are growing in terms of their economy, but also in terms of their aspirations. China certainly sees itself as now a peer competitor to the United States. But India also has its own ambitions. Indian economy is now one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, the fastest growing major economy in the world. And India has its own aspirations. India would like to play a much greater role in international institutions, in the United Nations Security Council, for example. And therefore, there are structural reasons why competition between China and India is unlikely to disappear. And in the United States, as far as the US is concerned, India does have a very significant strategic relationship with the United States. And not just strategic, but also, I think, strategic and economic relationship. So the significance for the United States for India is great. And I think India is unlikely to do anything which will harm India's relationship with the US to develop closer ties with China. Both the relationship, the Indo-US relationship and Indo-China relationship, have their own logic. And I think the relationship will continue to grow with China, but there are certain factors, I think, the structural factors, that will put a limit on how far they can go.
Now, for more related coverage on China-India relations, do log on to cna.asia or our mobile app for the very latest, including this analysis on how the new K visa from China could attract Indian tech talent to the country as the US tightens its immigration policies. A Japanese sushi legend, Jiro Ono, turns 100 today. Well, he's well known to food lovers for his 10-seat sushi bar in Tokyo's Ginza district that has won 3 Michelin stars yearly for more than a decade. Now, his restaurant was only dropped from the list after it stopped taking public reservations due to overwhelming demand. It now only sees regulars and guests from top hotels.
100歳、来月お誕生日ということですが、おめでとうございます。ありがとうございます。もうね。
The renowned chef marked Japan's Respect for the Aged Day last month, where Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike wished him happy birthday in advance. When asked the secret to longevity, Mr. Ono said working is the best medicine and signaled his intent to work for 5 more years. Well, he still serves sushi himself from time to time, but only to his special customers.
今もう現役でちょっと店出るっていうのは毎日は出てこられないのでドクターマティック製品なんて話をそれはやりますけれどももう仕事は100歳になったらちょっと難しくなる100歳になっても働けたらなるべく働くように働くことが一番薬だと思います。
Mr. Ono once famously turned down the Japanese government in 2014 for a reservation for the then leaders of Japan and the United States, Shinzo Abe and Barack Obama. The two only managed to dine at the restaurant after shifting their schedules to accommodate. Mr. Ono's devotion to his craft was featured in the 2012 film Jiro Dreams of Sushi. According to his son, Mr. Ono is now aiming to live to 114 to become Japan's oldest man. Calling it doable, the aged chef said that he will cherish his life so that he can get to keep working for a long time.
Jiro still comes in, and it's an incredible thing that this tradition continues, and that he's still going strong 100 years in. I mean, it's an inspiration to everyone.
Now, once again, happy birthday, Jiro. And on that note, to wrap up East Asia Tonight for Monday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.